Hello class, this is John Studi, and I'm here to welcome you back to class after spring break. And this week we're going to be diving right into some of the most fun aspects, funnest parts of St. Thomas's metaphysics. And that is, of course, how we predicate certain things of God and his doctrine of analogy. And now I will venture to say that if you don't understand analogy, then you're going to have a really hard time understanding anything in Thomism, particularly anything having to do with metaphysics or natural theology. Now, this doesn't mean you have to understand everything in this lecture to the fullest degree. However, you should be working really hard to make sure the material covered in this week is something that you are very familiar with and is well established in your mind. Because the doctrine of analogy is basically everywhere in St. Thomas's writings. Now this week we're going to be covering how God is universally perfect and possessing all perfections, and we'll also discuss the differences between univocal, equivocal, and analogical predication. And finally, we're going to discuss discuss how nothing can be predicated univocally of God and creatures, but how some things can be predicated analogically of God and creatures. Now, like I said before, the topic of analogy is a very important one in the metaphysics of St. Thomas Aquinas. In fact, it's what I think is one of the four most important doctrines, metaphysically speaking, in the philosophy of St. Thomas. The others, of course, being active potency, essence and existence, participation, and this week's topic, analogy. Now, the order I just gave them also reflects the order in which we will usually learn them. For example, in the 5 ways, we usually begin with a certain understanding of the nature of actuality and the nature of existence, and understanding of existence. So, for instance, we see things that, ignore that generation corruption thing. We first make a judgment that things exist, right? So we see things, hey, this tree exists in my front yard. And then we reflect on that act of existence. Whoa, hey, if it didn't exist, and all the various tree things that it does would never be happening right here in front of me. And so we see that existence is the perfection of all perfections, without which no other perfections of being could possibly be presence. And so the things of our experience, such as generation, corruption, show us that the sensible things around us only have existence in an accidental sense. It doesn't belong to them essentially. And what's more is that it doesn't belong to them accidentally in the same sense of a categorical accident like color or height or length or position, but rather it's pre-categorical, meaning that existence is something that precedes the essence or the substance itself. And so that means that the substance itself cannot be the cause of its own existence, and it can't be the source of its own existence. But rather we have to posit that there's something that ultimately causes the existence in that thing. And in final analysis, we learned that in order to account for the existence of things at all at any time, we must conclude to something in whom essence and existence coincide. And now, here I think that we could say that if we understand esse as the act of all act, the perfection of all perfections, etc., then if we find something that has existence concretely in an unlimited sense by essence, then whatever that thing is will have all perfections of being by essence. But what does that mean? I think we can generally get an idea of that, but we can't grasp it all at once. It's something that escapes our mind. So now St. Thomas says that the proper object of human understanding is being, and being is intelligible. But normally when we conceptualize things, we have to do it by placing some sort of limit around it. Like, for instance, if I just think of being in a very vague and general sense, I don't know if that means fly or dog or cat or mouse or tree or whatever else it might mean. But once we limit being to some specific range of existential activities, such as being wooden, hard, growing, taking nutrition, photosynthesis, we won't be able to understand that it's a tree versus a fly. But once we understand those limitations, or once we place those limitations around the thing, then we start understanding what the thing is, what the thing is in front of me. And so when we go to talk about God, sometimes we'll try to focus or zoom in on certain aspects of the being that we find in creatures, and speak of God as the cause of those things. We'll cover that more in just a moment here. But because God's nature is a pure and unlimited act of existence, it completely escapes our knowledge. Again, we need some sort of definition. We need to put some sort of limit on it, and so we can get our minds around it. What's worse, though, is that usually when we think about something, we think about it with an image, because sensible or material or mobile being is the kind of being that we're most familiar with. For instance, just think of a triangle. Now, did you think of a triangle that had some sort of color or size? Well, yeah, you probably did. You probably had some sort of mental image conjured up, rather than simply the definitional content of what a triangle is. And this can be helpful for giving us an approximation, or getting us going in the right direction of our understanding of who God is. For instance, people say that, or of what God is. For instance, people say things like, I imagine God, or I think about God, and I think of this pure white light. Okay, great. It gives you the impression that God is that by which all things can be seen, or that by which or that God is pure and doesn't have any imperfections. Good. Wonderful, beautiful. It's not really an accurate representation of God's nature to say that he is light. Well, why? Well, because God's not a photon. That's not how he is. And that wouldn't make any sense, because then God would have to be some sort of limited thing. Or likewise, we could think of God as an old man with a crowd ruling over the universe. And now, while this gives us an image to think about regarding God's wisdom and his divine providence, it doesn't give us a proper image of God as ipsum esse subsistens, or it doesn't really reflect that the conclusion that we arrived at in the 5 ways. And so the problem with God talk and predicating certain things of God is that the conclusion that we're reaching the 5 ways, which is that God is, that there's a first cause who is ipsum esse subsistens, or is a pure and unlimited act of existence, is just too much for our minds to get around. It's kind of like how like you take a nocturnal animal like an owl, and you suddenly place it in front of a bright spotlight or the sun, and now the owl might be able to see like shadows and figures, or kind of vaguely know what's in front of it, but the light is going to be too powerful for it, and it's not really going to be able to make any it's not going to be able to offer any intelligible or distinct statements, or have any real good understanding of what's in front of it in a distinct and concrete way. But from the knowledge of God as ipsum esse subsistens, all the divine attributes can be derived, but again, we can't get all of them in just one go. But we also can't speak of God as we do of creatures, because every finite thing only has esse by participation, whereas God has esse essentially. So there's a huge difference between what we can say of creatures and what we can say of God. And this last aspect here, that God has esse essentially and we have esse by participation, is crucial for understanding St. Thomas's primary approach to talking about God, which is through analogy. And so we're going to think about that real quick, about the distinction between being and essence. And so when we look at, when we look at a demonstration of God's existence, we see that the things of our world don't have existence that's given to them or they don't have existence in an essential way. Rather, it's accidental. And ultimately we come to discover that whatever causes the existence of things is something that is essentially existence. And this leads, in St. Thomas, to the notion that creatures are beings, that is, they are things which habens esse or have esse by participation. Why? Well, because they receive their being from God, who has esse, or existence, by his very essence. Sort of like how a light has illumination, or the capacity to illuminate by its very essence. But something like a mirror only has it by participation in the activity of the light, insofar as it reflects what is going on in the light. And so we can say truly that the light and the mirror illuminate, but the way in which they do it is radically different. Whereas one has it essentially, the light bulb, the other one has it only accidentally or by participation. Now, Aquinas expresses the notion of participation this way: that which has existence but is non-existence is a being by participation. And participation, again, means to share or to take part in something. Now, you could have several mirrors, for instance, that reflect light from the light bulb in various ways. Or you can have because the mirrors themselves are colored, or they've got grease on them, or something along those lines. So to participate means to take part or to share in it. So all these things are taking part in the luminosity of the light bulb, even though they don't have it in themselves. Making this more concrete and applied to metaphysics, Socrates shares in humanity because he does not exhaust the whole of humanity itself. Otherwise, all men would be Socrates. And I hear that, well, Socrates is pretty ugly. But you people, you humans that I'm speaking to right now, you all are very beautiful. So clearly, you're not the same as Socrates. And so when we speak of a particular person's participation in a genus, or rather a species like humanity, what we're saying is that they really do have humanity, but they don't exhaust the full meaning of what it means to be human in their one act of humanity, because there can be other instances of humans. Substances can likewise participate in accidents, because you can have a red ball. The ball, the substance, participates in the accident of redness. Why? Because all of redness isn't exhausted in the ball. Because you can also have a red flower, or red hair, or a red book. Matter can share in form, and I mean this both accidentally and substantial form. Because matter, the matter which makes up a tree, can be doesn't exhaust all of the instances of the substantial form of tree, because the substantial form of tree can exist in several different trees. Effects also participate in their cause, especially when the effect is not equal to the cause. For instance, if going back to the light example, the mirrors participate in the light as the cause of their ability to illuminate something else. And so, for instance, if you have a laser pointer, you could shoot it at you could shoot it at a mirror on the other side of the room and angle it so it actually points around the corner. And now the laser pointer has the capacity to blast out a laser of its own nature or whatever, but the mirror does not have that. Rather, it's something that's caused in the mirror by the laser reflecting off of it, and then it has the ability to go around. Then it goes around the corner. So the mirror participates in laser pointering or whatever because it's being caused, because the ability to point a laser or to have a laser coming from it is caused by something that it is itself a laser. And accidents can also participate in the being of substances, since substances more fully possess being and more directly possess being than accidents. If it weren't the case, then every time we gained weight or lost weight, then we would be losing existence in a very substantial sense. But that doesn't make any sense. Just think of it this way: we as individuals, we exist as the same substance at one end of our weight loss spectrum and at the other end of our weight loss spectrum. But the accident, the quantitative accident, exactly how much we weigh, changes in that time, and so the accident actually loses its precise existence, even though it is possessed, even though the substance remains in existence throughout the entire process of change. And what emerges from all of this is an existentialist metaphysics, where being or existence or esse is primarily understood, again, as existence, and existence is understood as an act, or if you prefer, actuality. And so the act of weighing 150 pounds is different than the act of weighing 145 pounds, or the act of being pale is different from the act of being tan. But in both situations, the accident, which really does have existence, only has existence insofar as it's participating in the substance in which it adheres. And this, of course, is a part of St. Thomas's metaphysical revolution. And as such, being, or esse, which should be primarily understood as the act of existence and is participated by creatures, will have a large role to play in Aquinas' teaching on analogy. We'll find out why in a few minutes here. And we'll see that Aquinas' existential revolution in metaphysics would actually be incomplete without his teaching on analogy. And there are both epistemological and metaphysical reasons for this. Now, analogy is a difficult doctrine, and that's the case for several reasons. First, it's hard to find one dedicated treatise on analogy in the corpus of St. Thomas. In fact, he doesn't really have one. Instead, he talks about analogy in about 12 different passages scattered over some of his works, like the Principles of Nature, his commentary on the sentences of Peter of Lombard. He has something on in his disputed questions on truth, the power of God, the Summa Contra Gentiles, Summa Theologiae, of course, and also in his commentaries on Aristotle's Metaphysics and Ethics. But he doesn't have like a Questiones Disputate Analogia or whatever. He doesn't have a full treatise devoted specifically to the disputed questions on analogy. Another reason why analogy can be so difficult is that there's a lot of disagreements among scholars about how to reconstruct a coherent understanding of analogy from St. Thomas's disparate texts. And I think the most difficult problem is that most Thomists seem to think that Aquinas' doctrine of analogy is primarily about our formal concepts rather than about judgments and operations of things. Or another way to say this is that they often place analogy in the realm of forms and logic rather than in the realm of esse and metaphysics. And many scholars also follow the terminology of St. Thomas de Vio, also known as Cardinal Cajetan, when talking about analogy, and they'll employ phrases like extrinsic attribution and proportionate causality. And these terms are useful, I think, because they do offer some real insights as to what St. Thomas is getting at here, and it helps us systematize it a little bit more easily. But they also lead to some real misunderstandings. So my approach, our existentialist approach, now if you've taken metaphysics elsewhere and you've already learned a bit about the doctrine of analogy, I wish you to join me and I will complete your training. And together we will overthrow the manualists and rule together as teacher and pupil. That is, of course, a quote from Darth Gilson speaking to Father Joseph Owens, who at one point, is actually a phenomenal Aristotelian scholar, but is now turned existentialist extraordinaire. So, in any case, I will be drawing on people such as Dr. Robert Delfino, Dr. Peter Redpath, Armand Maurer, and Father Norris Clark for my understanding of analogy. And these people, as you'll find out, take a slightly different approach. They don't look at they don't look primarily at the concepts of our predication, but rather they look at the judgments, which is what I think analogy is chiefly about. And now we're going to be encountering people who will, speak in these Cajetanian terms or whatever, like extrinsic attribution, blah blah blah. So those things are important for us to understand. But you guys will see that there's a bit of a difference between the way that the existentialist school of Thomism approaches analogy, and what many of us are used to with analogy, as we have maybe heard it from other camps. But don't get hung up too much on the differences. Just take the lecture for what it is. What you find to be good and useful, keep, and what you do not find to be good and useful, go ahead and discard. Now, let's talk about God and about some of the epistemological and metaphysical reasons for Aquinas' doctrine of analogy. So, metaphysically speaking, Aquinas argues in questions 1 through 11 of the first part of the Summa that God is radically different from all creatures. For instance, God alone is infinite, eternal, unchanging, uncaused, perfect, and subsistent existence itself. But because God is so radically unlike creatures, it makes sense that human words really can't be predicated univocally of God, meaning with the same voice or in the exact same manner. And Aquinas is emphatic on this point. In the Summa Theologiae, Part 1, Question 13, Answer 5, he says that univocal predication is indeed impossible between God and creatures. And now, most of the time, Aquinas talks about God. He does so in the context of predication. And so let's discuss predication a bit here. In predication, we affirm or deny something about God, we affirm or deny something about the existence of something, or about the reality of something. For example, we can predicate human of Socrates and Plato. Sorry about that. We can talk about we can predicate human of Socrates and Plato. In this case, I'm affirming something of them, namely that they're human, rather than cats or dogs, and that they exist as humans should they be found to exist. And because the word human has the exact same meaning in the sentences, Socrates is human and Plato is human, I'm employing that term in what is called univocal predication. Again, univocal means one voice, so it means it just has one meaning. However, sometimes we use the same word with completely different meanings. For example, if I say, this thing's bark is worse than its bite, while pointing to a dog, I mean that this little Pomeranian, despite his threats, is not capable of inflicting serious damage to an intruder. Here's a fun fact. My wife's sister, had a neighbor who had these two evil little Pomeranian dogs. Evil creatures. They look like cotton balls with teeth. Anyway, so they would always bark at me whenever I walked by their house. And one day, their owner took taken them out to go to the bathroom, and they were doing their thing. As I walked past their house, one of the dogs got loose and came up and bit me right in the butt. Now, I wasn't afraid of these dogs. It stung a little bit. Didn't even leave a mark though. But it was totally worth it because the neighbor made me a huge plate of cookies to say sorry. They thought I was really ticked off. I didn't really care. But man, those things were annoying. Anyway. On the other hand, so the first, this thing's bark is worse than its bite. Then I mean that this little Pomeranian, again, despite his threats, is not really capable of inflicting serious damage on an intruder. Although they like to act like they are. They can't. But if I say this thing's bark is worse than its bite while pointing to a cinnamon tree, then what I would mean is that the tree is indeed spicy, but it's not very tasty. There's several levels of puns there. And I had, for those of you who don't know, actually, cinnamon comes from a tree bark. And the word bite is kind of connecting to the Spanish word picante, which means spicy, but it also kind of has that relationship to the root word bite. Anyway, it's a lot of bad puns. In either case, I'm not using the word in the exact same meaning, because in one sense, the word bite means spicy, and in the other sense, bite means to masticate, to use your teeth to chomp down on something. It doesn't have the same meaning at all. And this is what we call an example of equivocal predication. And now, one reason why analogy is very important in the metaphysics of Aquinas is because in how it concerns our language, the language that we use to talk about God, is because univocal predication is completely unsatisfactory with respect to God. So is equivocal predication. For example, if I say that Socrates is intelligent, Socrates is intelligent, and God is intelligent. I claim that intelligent is being predicated univocally. Then I'm claiming that that the statement God is intelligent means the same thing as Socrates is intelligent. But that's clearly not the case, because I would have to be dropping God down to the level of a human being, especially Socrates, or I would be elevating Socrates to the level of God. But to do either of these things is obviously absurd. However, Socrates is not God, right? And God is not intelligent in the same way that humans is. Even if it is the case, like Aquinas says, that humans are created in the image of God, we're just not the same thing, and we don't have the same kind of intelligence or way of knowing. Equivocal predication is also unacceptable when we're talking about natural theology. Again, if I say Socrates is intelligent and God is intelligent, but now I say that intelligent means something completely different in both, then I have no idea what intelligent means in God. I might know what intelligence means in Socrates, but if the word intelligent doesn't have the same meaning in any way between my predicating it of Socrates and my predicating it of God, then I have no idea what I'm talking about, and you have no idea what I'm talking about either. And so we would never be able to say anything positive about God if we can't say anything about him univocally or through equivocal predication. It seems like we can't say anything about God. But there's a solution. And there are two ways that Aquinas poses to get around this. And first is the via negativa, which is also known as apophaticism or remotion. The second being analogy. Let's start with the first. So, the via negativa. St. Thomas talks about this in his Disputed Questions on God, question 7, answer 5, where he says, "It is because the human intelligence is not equal to the divine essence that the same divine essence surpasses our intelligence and is unknown to us. Wherefore man reaches the highest point of his knowledge about God when he knows that he knows him not, inasmuch as he knows that which is God transcends whatsoever he conceives of him. So nothing that we can conceive of about God will fully grasp his meaning and fully grasp exactly what God is. However, we should never despair, because even partial true knowledge of God is true knowledge of God, and knowledge of the higher things, even a little bit of it, is more valuable than even perfect knowledge of the lowest things." And so when we talk about remotion or apophaticism or the via negativa, what we're doing is we're saying something about God's nature by stating what he is not. And we can do this based on each of the conclusion that we reach from each of the 5 ways. In the first way, for instance, we can deny that God changes and therefore say he's immutable or impassible. The second way, we can say that God's power is not conditioned by another and therefore all-powerful. The third way denies that God is dependent and is therefore necessary or independent. Fourth way denies that God is in any way limited in his perfection of possession of the transcendental, and his nature is therefore identical to goodness, but in an unlimited sense. The fifth way allows to deny that God is for anything other than for himself, and so we can say that he's not for another. But we can also flip it and say, well, that means that all other things are directed towards him. Or we can say that God's power is not conditioned, so therefore his power is unlimited, or his power is infinite. Either way, we're using some sort of negative terms to say something about God, and we can know something about God. We know that he exists, and the way that he exists is in a way that he doesn't change. He's immutable. He doesn't have parts. He is completely independent in his existence, and he is unlimited in his power, etc., etc. But the via negativa only gives us a very murky and difficult understanding of God's nature. So thankfully, there's another method of understanding God's nature through reason, analogy. And if we want to defend the view that some things can be predicated analogously of God and creatures, then we must offer some justification for our position. So what is it that could possibly justify analogous predication in the context of God? That is to say that, what connects God and creatures that could be the basis of predicating intelligence analogously of God and Socrates, for example? And the answer simply is causality. Metaphysically speaking, an analogical predication is possible because God is the cause of the being of creatures, and reasoning from effect to cause, we can we can obtain knowledge of God. And this is the epistemological reason for Aquinas' doctrine of analogy. So let's explore that next. So St. Thomas in the Summa Theologiae, part 1, question 2, article 2, Aquinas says very clearly that we can only know God through God's effects. Where he says, when an effect is better known to us through than its cause, from the effect we proceed to the knowledge of the cause. And from every effect, the existence of its proper cause can be demonstrated, so long as its effects are better known to us. But since every effect depends upon its cause, if the effect exists, the cause must also pre-exist. Hence, the existence of God, insofar as it is not self-evident to us, can be demonstrated from those effects of His which are known to us. So the 5 ways, then, we start from things in the sensible world that we experience to an ultimate cause that is necessary to explain these how these sensible things act and exist at all. And which brings us to an epistemological reason for St. Thomas's doctrine of analogy. In the next response to the objection, he says this: from the effects not proportionate to the cause, no perfect knowledge of the cause can be obtained. Yet, from every effect, the existence of the cause can be clearly demonstrated. And so we demonstrate the existence of God from His effects, though from them we cannot perfectly know what He is in His essence. And so we need to think about God in terms of His causality rather than some sort of logical similarity. And this is the basis of analogy, because every effect must in some way resemble its cause. You know, this is the exemplar formal causality, which we discussed when treating the 4th way. Remember how I said before that something can participate in the cause. Or in its cause, and sometimes the cause is a exemplar formal cause. And so if we couldn't find somehow something about the effect as pre-contained in the cause, then we'd be getting something from nothing, which is absurd. And so this relates to the principle of proportionate causality. Whatever we find in the effect must somehow pre-exist in the cause, and there's a few different ways that this happens. First, St. Thomas says that, and we can see this in his Summa, St. Thomas says that whatever perfection exists in an effect must be found in the effective cause, or the efficient cause. And it can be found either formally, if it's a univocal agent, such as when a man produces a man, or in a more eminent degree, if it's in a univocal agent. Thus, the Son is the likeness of whatever is... thus, in the Son is the likeness of whatever is generated by the Son's power. And he goes on to say, now it is plain that the effects pre-exist virtually in the efficient cause. And although to pre-exist in the potentiality of a material cause is to pre-exist in a more imperfect way, little commentary here, because to pre-exist in potentiality of a material cause to pre-exist in an imperfect way is because you need to it needs to receive the act, and so there's no perfection that's found in of being a chair that's found in wood. Rather, the perfection of being a chair is found primarily in the exemplar formal cause of the chair, in the mind of the carpenter, and it's that perfection or that act that's given to the matter, and the matter receives it. But on the other hand, in an efficient cause, the agent has that perfection in a way that's more perfect. And so when a perfection pre-exists virtually in any efficient cause, to pre-exist is to be in a way that the effect exists in the cause more perfectly than it does in the effect, or rather, the perfection pre-exists in the cause in a more fulsome manner than the way it exists in the effect. And so, St. Thomas goes on to say, Therefore, God is the first sufficient cause of all things. The perfections of all things must pre-exist in God in a more eminent way. Let me just restate that real quick here. So, when we talk about God, when we look at the creatures in the world, we know that no effect can give more than what it has. No cause can give more than what it has. And so, when God creates things that exist, he can create everything that exists will somehow be pre-contained in God. And now this can be contained either formally, as in it has the exact same form, like when one person begets another, so you still have a human and a human. It's the exact same form that's being passed between the two. Or when you have the form of fire existing in one log that's then passed on to another log in their fire pit. That's a formal way of how the perfection can pre-exist in the cause. And now it can also exist eminently, and so it can exist to a much greater degree. For instance, you can think of it's like fire. So heat, the form of heat exists both in fire on Earth that we find in a log, but we also find it existing in a much greater degree in the sun. The sun has heat to I'm not exactly sure what the numbers are, but I'm sure it's thousands of times more powerfully than what we have in a fire in a log. But the sun can nevertheless cause the fire in the log, even though the kind of fire that we find in the log is not formally the exact same kind of same expression, same kind of heat as we would find in the sun. The heat in the sun has the power to give it to the log, because the form of fire pre-exists in the sun's more eminent manner of being hot. And St. Thomas goes on to say, secondly, from what has already been proved, God is existence itself, or itself subsistent existence. Consequently, he must contain within himself the whole perfection of being. And for it is clear that some hot thing is not made For it is clear that if some hot thing has not the whole perfection of heat, this is because heat is not participated in its full perfection. But if heat were some sort of self-subsisting thing, nothing of the virtue of heat would be wanting in it. So if we found something that was by nature hot and entirely and unlimitedly hot, well, it would be able to make all sorts of different fires and all sorts of different kinds of heats. Since, therefore, God is subsisting being itself, nothing of the perfections of being can be found wanting in him. And now all created perfections are included in the perfections of beings, for the things are perfect precisely insofar as they have being after some fashion. It follows, therefore, that the perfections of no one thing is found wanting in God. In other words, because we know that God is ipsum esse subsistence itself, and if God's nature is an unbounded and unlimited active existence, then none of the perfections of those things which have a limited active existence would ever be able to exceed the perfections that we would find in God. And so, all the perfections of things that we find in this world must somehow pre-exist within God. And they can, again, either be formally, as in the one-to-one correlation, which isn't the case, can be eminently, which I think is at least partly the case, because God has being in an unlimited sense, wheras we have being in a limited sense. And we can also find it virtually, insofar as God has the power to cause certain things in being, I have in mind the limitations that we find in being, which is why we don't have to say that because God causes matter, that he is material, but rather that God has the power, the capacity to limit being to such an extent that it takes on a material way of existing. Because matter is somehow less perfect than something that's immaterial. Now, let's think about this again. Now, in the case of two human parents causing a human child, human is predicated univocally of the mother, the father, and the child. But let's think about this in the case of God. Nothing he causes can be identical to him, as we've already discussed, because only one thing can be pure being, or ipsum esse, subsistence itself. And so anything that God creates can only be analogous to him. Indeed, everything that exists besides God will have some sort of composition. For example, even an angel, although it contains no matter, still has a real distinction between its existence and its essence, and is therefore a composite creature. But in God, there is absolutely no composition, and therefore there is no distinction between God's being and essence. They're identical. This is, by the way, why being cannot be predicated univocally of God and creatures. Now, while it's true to say that both God and the angel exists, the way in which they exist is not the same. And it's because of this real distinction between being and essence in creatures that being can be predicated truly of God and truly of creatures, albeit only analogously, which we'll talk about in a moment here. And we can know something true about God and creatures when we say that both exists, even though the term exist does not have a direct one-to-one correlation in both instances. Because after all, partial knowledge is still true knowledge. In fact, if there is no analogical predication in being, then all of our predicating is equivocal, and then all five ways of proving God's existence would no longer work. Well, why? Well, it's because if the words that we use insofar as they predicate God and creatures have completely different meanings, then there would be no unambiguous or non-ambiguous middle terms in the five ways. That is, there would be no connection between God and creatures. And so the five ways would be formally invalid because they would commit the fallacy of equivocation, which is exactly what St. Thomas says in Summa Theologiae, Part 1, Question 13, Answer 5. And so the only way we can talk about God would be if there were some sort of midway point between univocal and equivocal predication. That is, a kind of predication where what is predicated of God and creatures is not identical, but also not completely different. Roughly speaking, when we make an analogy, we're relating something to something else because of a similarity present among differences. But again, there's more to it than that. And so let's talk more about the meaning of analogy in Aquinas. Now, analogy, in the beginning. In the world of ancient Greek philosophy, Aristotle, it was Aristotle who starts to develop the notion of analogy in a deeper way. And he uses the term analogia, which broadly speaking refers to any similarity of relationship between two things. For example, in his work, The History of Animals, Aristotle says that the scales of a fish are analogous to the feathers of a bird. So this is what Aquinas would call the analogy of proportionality. And in this kind of analogy, that is the analogy of proportionality, we have four terms, also called analogous. So in this case, the birds and the fish, scales are related to fish as feathers are related to birds. And so when making this analogy, what we're saying is that the relationship between scales and fish is similar, although not identical, to the relationship between birds and feathers. However, Aquinas will also talk about the analogy of proportion, which is simpler because it only requires 2 or 3 terms are analogous. And we find this in, for instance, De Veritate 2, question 2, answer 11. Now, the example he uses is that substance and accidents are both beings. And we can use the term being analogously. And this is because a substance is not a being in the same way as an accident is a being, because an accident is dependent on the substance. But they both qualify as beings because they are really existing things. And although both kinds of analogy, proportion and proportionality, are discussed in the context of predication, a predicate is understood differently by the logician and the philosopher, the metaphysician, which was something we've talked about earlier in the semester. But let's talk about that again just to refresh our memories. In predication, we have a subject, something that we're talking about, a copula, some sort of form of the word to be, and a predicate, something we're saying about the subject. So when we say S is a P, we are predicating of a subject, for example, healthy of bread. When we say that bread or fruit or whatever, the subject, is the copula, healthy, the predicate. Fruit is healthy. Bread is healthy. Now, many Thomists make a mistake by focusing on the predicate as the logician would. So what they do is what they should do is focus on the predicate term, which includes the copula is, as the philosopher would. because remember, the genus of the logician and the genus of the philosopher are going to be different, because one is existentially neutral, the other one includes existence in the way things act. So I'm going to borrow an example from a wonderful philosopher named Armand Maurer, who notes that the logician uses univocal predication when predicating the term substance of material and immaterial substances. However, such as, for instance, the persons of Socrates and Michael the Archangel. However, Maurer notes that the philosopher can only analogously predicate substance of material and immaterial beings, because the philosopher, the metaphysician, considers the natures of things as they actually exist in reality. And in actual existence, the substance of material things is not the same as the existence of immaterial things. In logical predication, the logician considers substance merely as a definition and in sort of an existentially neutral way. So in focusing on the definition of substance, we focus on its constituent parts, namely that it is some sort of concrete form. The Archangel Michael is an essence that exists, and Socrates is an essence, let's pretend he's alive, is an essence that also has existence. So the logician predicates substance univocally of each, because we just have a substance here and a substance there. However, the philosopher does not predicate this way. The philosopher is aware of the definition of substance, but also includes an understanding of substance as something that is a cause or a principle of activity. And when we take this into account, we think about Socrates as requiring a material body to be a substance, whereas the Archangel Michael does not require a body to be a substance. So in this way, the philosopher cannot use the term substance of St. Michael and Socrates univocally, but only analogously. I like to think of the philosophical genus, or the philosophical use of terms, sort of like a movie, because it reflects the way in which the subject of our predication is actually is acting in reality. Whereas the way that the logician thinks about it, it's more of a snapshot. It kind of gives us this quick definition of what a thing is. A substance is a thing to whom it belongs, not to be another. Great. You can say that both of Socrates and of St. Michael univocally, but that would only be a logical way of thinking about it, or a way of thinking about it in terms of our definition or second intentions rather than first intentions, which looks at the way things act in reality. And if you're trying to understand St. Thomas' teaching on analogy only by focusing on the definitional content of the predicate, then you're making a mistake. Again, you are focusing on the logical genus. However, the doctrine of analogy is not about logic. It's a branch of philosophy. It's about a branch of philosophy known as metaphysics. So while it's true that analogy deals with concepts and terms, their analogy is primarily concerned with judgment and the activities of real things and their relationships. Concepts and terms are part of relations and judgments that premises express, but just in an extended fashion. Let's tackle the analogy of attribution here. So we can examine the differences between focusing on the predicate as the logician would versus focusing on the predicate as a philosopher, which also takes into account operational aspects of the thing known through judgment, in which the analogy of proportion, an example of the analogy of proportion that we find in Article 5 of question 13 of Summa's Theologiae Primum Pars. So there, St. Thomas gives the example of many things being proportionate, analogous, to one another, or to one thing, where he says, healthy is predicated of medicine and urine in relation and in proportion to the health of a body, of which the former is the sign and the latter the cause. And this first kind of analogy of attribution is what we call analogy of extrinsic attribution. Now, post-Catechton, this example of predicating health of a person and also of medicine and urine came to be known as an example, again, of extrinsic attribution. And we call it extrinsic attribution instead of just proportion because healthy belongs truly only to living things which can be healthy. but urine and medicine are not living, and so therefore they can't really have health. Nevertheless, there's still a relationship, a real relationship and connection between medicine, the man, and his urine. And in this kind of analogy, there's a prime analogate, the healthy person, in relation to which medicine and urine are called healthy only because medicine causes health and urine is a sign or an effect of health. But because many Thomists only focus on the logical aspect of this, look at the definitional content, and therefore only focus on that, they ironically focus on an univocal understanding of the term health in a way that awkwardly tries to extend to medicine and urine through cause and effect. So again, medicine and urine do not have health. But there's a better way to explain why health is analogous in this case. And we're able to do this because we argue that we should focus on the philosophical genus health, which also takes into account all the operational aspects known through judgment. And when we add in some of these operational aspects of the thing that we're talking about, health, the total meaning of the predicate term, which again includes the copula is, that is how it's related to the other parts of our analogy, we find that we can use the word health analogous. And so the term, which is the definitional content of health, retains its generic meaning, health. But the total meaning of what's being said, let me get that back here. The total meaning of what's being said changes. For example, when I say that John, food, and medicine, and exercise are all healthy, my generic definition of what health is remains the same, because I'm saying that John is healthy, and I mean that health is united to John by being in John. But when I say that food, exercise, or medicine are healthy, what I mean is that such things are united by John by causing, restoring, or sustaining health. And so all of these things, according to Aquinas and Aristotle, what we find in analogy is that we have these predicates that all relate to this one subject, which is John. And so again, remember the chief subject the chief subject of philosophical predication is a really existing definite subject. In this case, again, John, which contains within it a form that generates substantial acts. So again, we're talking about the substance John. Since the form of health is joined in John, we predicate health primarily or per se of John. And we can predicate it of all other causes, other causal instruments or conditions or circumstances that in some way essentially relate to this substantial form per se, but unequally of other subjects. And so the term healthy is not being used with the same total meaning of John and medicine, which means that it's not being used univocally, but it's rather being used analogously. And so when we're looking at the terms health, or the terms John, or the term health as applied to John is healthy, medicine is healthy, and exercise is healthy, then what we're saying is that we're looking at how health is united to the subject John, and we only look at medicine and exercise insofar as they can help cause the form of health to unite in John. And that is the analogy of extrinsic attribution. Now, the analogy of intrinsic attribution is actually a stronger form of analogy, and is the analogy of intrinsic, and like the analogy of extrinsic attribution, it involves causality. In the case of intrinsic attribution, every analogate really possesses the predicate term, but in unequal measures or amounts, whereas in extrinsic causality, exercise and food don't actually contain health, right? Only John does. For example, we could say that when we predicate being of substance and accidents really do have being, but not in the same way. And so similarly, when we predicate being of Socrates and of God, both Socrates and God have being. Now, of course, God here is the prime analogate because God has being in a completely perfect and eminent way, whereas everything else only has being in an imperfect way by participation. The analogy of intrinsic attribution perfectly preserves God's transcendence while still allowing us to speak positively of God somehow and know true things about him. In fact, it is the transcendence of God that allows us to speak of God using an analogy of intrinsic attribution at all. William Wallace, a great Thomist, argues this way in his book on Elements of Philosophy, saying, in contrast to the formal or static analogy of proportionality, the analogy of intrinsic attribution is dynamic in that it is based explicitly on causality and dependency. To extend the example of existence of substance and accidents to that of subsistent being, esse belongs to ipsum esse subsistens alone, but is predicated of other things because they receive their esse in dependence on subsistent being itself. Such analogy is called intrinsic attribution because each being really does have esse intrinsically, even though it comes from another. Despite this inner or intrinsic aspect, however, whenever analogy of attribution is used, it also emphasizes the otherness of the characteristic participated in. All beings by participation in the esse of subsistent being. In this way, the analogy of proper proportionality can be seen to be related to and to presuppose the analogy of intrinsic attribution in the order of being. The use of both allows subsistent being to be transcendent or other when compared with other beings, and at the same time it allows esse to be participated and thus immanent or within other beings. So in other words, the dynamic between the analogates in the analogy of intrinsic attribution is based on causality and by participation. And the existence, for instance, you take the existence of substance versus the existence of accident. Both depend on subsistent being itself. But esse is intrinsic to both, although received. But esse, to be, remains, that keeps the same intrinsic meaning, the meaning to be, generally speaking, but only in reference to that in which they participate. And so the to be of an accident and a substance ultimately depend on God in whom they participate. And so the analogy is a comparison between those three things: God who is ipsum esse subsistence itself, and the esse of the substance, the esse of the accident. For instance, to give a kind of analogy, a mirror and a moon reflect the sun, but both still illuminate, right? But they illuminate, and you can say they're both luminous in relationship to the sun that's causing their luminosity. And what this does for us is it allows transcendence of God, the utter transcendence of God, without sacrificing genuine predication of existence or being in things other than God, in a way that's analogous and that can truly connect them to one another. Let's move on. Earlier we discussed Aristotle's example of how the scales of fish are analogous to the feathers of a bird with respect to moving. Now, Aristotle's example can make more sense to us by focusing on how scales and feathers operate in fish and birds. Feathers and scales are both coverings that help the creature in question move through their environment, right? Feathers help birds to fly in the air. Scales help fish swim in the water because they have hydrodynamic functions that reduce friction, water friction, and whatnot, so they can go forward. But scales and feathers are very different, and so are flying and swimming. But there's enough similarity in the former relation to an activity related to an activity related to the latter for an analogy to be made. And so there's enough similarity between swimming and flying that we can associate the role of feathers and the role of feathers and birds into the role of scales and fish. And now this is the analogy of proper proportionality, which we've covered a little before. But St. Thomas, I think, has a better example in De Veritate, question 2, article 11, when he says that sight is predicated of bodily sight and of the intellect, because understanding is in the mind as sight is in the eye. Okay, so now we have 4 analogates here. We have understanding, is to the mind as seeing is to the eye. And the idea is that understanding something in your mind is analogous to seeing something with your eye. More precisely, the first relationship between the understanding and the mind is analogous to the relationship between seeing and the eye, because both relationships 1 and 2 concern acts of knowing. But these acts are, again, only analogous, not identical. Sometimes proportionality is called intrinsic proportionality because the action, which, the action predicated, knowing, is really connected and common with all of the analogates. That is to say that understanding is intrinsic to the mind and seeing is intrinsic to the eye. However, the total meaning is different because seeing requires an optic nerve, whereas the mind doesn't. Whereas knowing doesn't require an eye, because somebody could be completely eyeless and still know something. However, in this case, there's and so the idea is that there's some sort of like form that the conscious subject is becoming aware of. And in one sense, it's in the sense of seeing, it's the knowledge of the sensible form, whereas or an awareness of the sensible form of through color, whereas in the mind it's the form of the thing itself. So you actually understand the substance, you understand the thing. So in both ways, there's some sort of like reception of what you're perceiving, in both seeing and in understanding, whereas seeing is received materially and understanding is received immaterially. Now in the case of proper proportionality, it actually doesn't seem like there's no prime analogate. However, in a way, God is the prime analogate, because seeing and understanding are only finite ways of knowing that in some way reflect God's perfect and eminent way of knowing. As we argued above, it is because all things participate in the being of God that the analogy of proper proportionality in a way presupposes the analogy of intrinsic attribution. So things only have sight or knowledge insofar as knowledge is something that's found perfectly in God. Now we also have another form of proportionality, the analogy of proportionality, which is one that we're more familiar with, which is what we call the analogy of improper proportionality, or metaphor. And this is the last thing we're going to discuss on analogy here, or last kind of analogy. Now, when we say that God is a lion, like we see in Amos 1:2, where it says, "The lion roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds dry up, and the top of Carmel withers." Aquinas notes that God is speaking, or that the scripture is speaking of God in a metaphor. Again, the God doesn't roar like a lion, and he doesn't thunder because he's not lightning that's burning the air. But rather, it's trying to tell us something. God roars like a lion. He's loud. We all know he's there. The pastures of the shepherds dry up. The Lord thunders from Jerusalem. He is loud. He's powerful, and he's strong enough to dry up the fields, and strong enough to make a big mountain crumble. Now, metaphors can be helpful in Scripture and in some other contexts like poetry or worship, but they're not useful in metaphysics, and they're not terribly useful in theology either. And this is because metaphor is not based on proper causal relations. God is the cause of a lion. The lion is not the cause of God. And so when you say something of the activity of a lion, for example, being like the leader of his pride, is analogous to God's leadership. However, again, the lion is not the cause of God. In addition, the lion carries with it the notion of being physical, whereas God does not carry the cause of being physical. And so there's only a loose similarity at best. So the most we can hope for with metaphor is a rough or loose way of describing a similarity between two things rather than pointing out a causal connection. Although it is loose speech, one can get a sense that God is a powerful leader when you say God is a lion, right? Great. But one can also express that God is a powerful leader without bringing a lion into the discussion, namely by saying that he is goodness itself, and we know that goodness is that for which all things strive. So God leads all things to their proper end. Great. And we say this in a way that is perfectly metaphysically sound. Now, humans enjoy metaphors because it can be fun to find some of these loose and disconnected meanings from each other, and we find a certain beauty in it. Now, I just want to note a couple of statements that St. Thomas has in the Summa about perfections, God, predications. And so in question 13, article 3, reply to objection 1, he says, there are some names which signify these perfections flowing from God to creatures in such a way that the imperfect way in which creatures receive the divine perfections is a part of the signification of the name. Is a part of the very signification of the name itself, as stone implies a material being, and names of this kind can only be applied to God in a metaphorical sense. Other names, however, express these perfections absolutely, without any such mode of participation, being part of their signification as the word being, good, living, and the like. Such names can be applied literally to God. And so this is something I really want to stress. When we talk about analogy in the proper sense, we're actually using it in a literal sense. It's real, true, literal knowledge that we're using to speak of God. When we're talking about certain terms or expressions that don't imply some sort of limit. But anything that implies a limit, such as materiality or finitude, cannot be applied to God in a literal or truly analogous sense, such as you couldn't say that God has a long arm, or the long arm of God. Okay, we're not actually saying that God has a long arm. That would be an imperfection. Rather, again, we're using some sort of metaphorical illusion or technique to say that God's justice will reach everyone. Okay, great. There's other ways to say that. St. Thomas also says that and so when we talk about things like being, good, living, and the like, power, these are attributes that can be attributed to God analogously and understood in him to be found in an unlimited way. St. Thomas also says, says that if the word God is good signified no more than God is the cause of all things, it might be in like manner said that God is the cause of material things. That God is material insofar as he is the cause of material things. We talked about this a little bit already. Therefore, we must hold to a different doctrine. So when we say that God is good, the meaning is not God is the cause of goodness, or that God is not evil, but the meaning is whatever good we attribute to creatures pre-exists in God, and in a more excellent and higher way. Hence, it does not follow that God is good because he causes goodness, but rather, on the contrary, he causes goodness in things because he is good. And so you can almost think of it like this. You say somebody's a good father based on, you could say somebody's a good father because of the kind things that he does to his children. However, it's not that the toy or the present I gave to my son last week is the cause of my goodness, or is the reason why you could say that I'm good. But rather, the reason why I gave the present to my son is because I love him and because I wanted him to have this gift. And so in the same way, God causes goodness in other things is only a sign of what God is, insofar as we understand that we say that God gives these good things because of what he is in the first place, rather than because he causes goodness, that God is good. So there's not the inverse relationship here. God causes good things. God causes goodness in things precisely because he is good, not that God is good because he does good things. It's a difference. Let's move on here real quick. The existentialist interpretation of analogy, and this I'm drawing a bit on the analogy of meaningfulness of language, or analogy and the meaningfulness of language about God, which is a reply to an analytic philosopher named Kai Nielsen, who criticizes the doctrine of analogy. And so, the existentialist interpretation of analogy prioritizes judgments over mere concepts, and so we should redirect our minds to the intellectual act whereby Aquinas says that we know existence, which is judgment. And knowing existence includes our awareness of how a thing is acting at the moment we are watching, because to act in some way is to exist in some way, right? So never forget, agere, sequitur esse. Action follows upon a thing's to be. So when we predicate analogously of creatures and God, what we predicate of analogously of creatures and God are actually what Norris Clark calls activity properties. And in keeping with Aquinas' existential metaphysics, we hold that being, or esse, is understood to be the primary notion of act. And this is the way that Father Clark explains it. What kind of things or aspects of reality or properties are thus required or given expression through analogous terms? As I see it, and I'm willing to defend this, even though it is not commonly mentioned, there is only one dimension of reality or kind of property that is capable of truly analogous expression. This is the realm of activities or dynamic functions we might call activity properties, understood in the widest possible sense, plus, of course, the opposite correlative properties of receiving, being acted upon, loving, such as loving and being loved, causing and being caused, are all equally analogous. All such properties are expressed originally and primarily by verbs, that is something they're doing something, not nouns, but or they are in some way reducible to verbs. Analogous terms can, of course, be used of nouns, but the noun presupposes the verb. For example, it signifies a subject, but as the doer of some certain action, which aspect alone is made explicit, as in the knower, the lover, the runner. The reason why activity properties are such fit candidates for analogous expressions is that the same general kind of activity can be performed quite differently by different kinds of agents or subjects without destroying the similarity and the difference of the activity aspect itself. This is not true of forms, structures, quantitative relations, and the like, which are not elastic in their realizations. Different kinds of things in the universe, different levels of being, are not like each other in their essential specific forms or essences considered statically, but they are proportionally alike in their modes of activity or in their dynamic functions. Different forms can only be compared as alike insofar as they are forms or structures for similar actions. If there is any formal structure to analogous concepts, it is not strictly logical or formal structure, but the structure of an activity situation. An analogous term expresses this general kind of activity, X, recognized as being carried in one distinctive proportionate way by subject A, in another distinctively different proportionate way by subject B, etc. The subject and modes of acting are quite different in each case. The activities themselves are recognized as proportionally similar, or with a similar indifference. Let me add one more thing. That if the term activity itself here is allowed to explain its full analogous breadth of a limit of meaning, existence then is not only can be described, but is uniquely appropriate to be described as the most radical kind of activity or act, the act of presencing. And this is the Thomistic analogous notion of being itself, that which has or exercises the act of being. In conclusion, at this point, we can finally formulate a general understanding of analogy in the context of Aquinas' existentialist revolution in metaphysics. Analogy is rooted in exemplar causality and participation. Creatures receive their very being from God and thereby participate in God's nature, esse, in ways that more or less approach God as the exemplar and maximum cause as the full perfection of what it means to exist. The logician should not be used. The analogy or the predication of logician should not be used in metaphysics because it only concerns univocal predication. And the philosopher takes what the logician has to say, but only secondarily, and instead takes the operations of the analogists as its primary focus, how things are acting in reality, and uses those things as the reference point for his various analogous predications, such as with the with sight and knowing in the eye and in the mind. Operational activities can be performed differently by different kinds of agents or subjects without destroying the similarity and difference between of the activity aspect itself. Both metaphysical knowing, both metaphysical knowledge, that is knowledge of a thing's nature, and sight are kinds of knowledge, but they're different kinds of knowledge because of the different kinds of things that are doing the knowing. Similarly, the kind of knowing that God has is true knowing, but it's a truer kind of knowing than the kind of knowledge that we have as finite intellectual creatures. And so our focus in analogy should be on the operations and actions of things, where we use the active judgment. So we see that an eye is knowing, or a seeing creature is that which is knowing, and an intellectual creature is that which is knowing. Different things. And so we can recognize then that being is predicated analogously of God and creatures, because the being that God has is unlimited and essential, whereas the being that creatures have is participated in and limited and accidental to the creature. The most important kind of analogy is the analogy of intrinsic attribution, followed by the analogy of proper proportionality, which again is the second most important. And finally, the analogy of extrinsic attribution, which is the third most important. A metaphor, or the analogy of improper proportionality, has no use in the science of metaphysics because it's not based on proper causal relation. Rather, it's only useful for conveying certain concepts to the uninstructed, to children, or for some poetic meaning. For your reference, courtesy of my professor, Dr. Delfino, I give you this chart of analogy, which could kind of help give you a visualization to break down these things. And if this was difficult for you, which I expected it to be sure to read what we have for our required readings this week in the Summa, as well as in McInerney. But also, there's a document that I posted to Populi called, I think I called it Big Bird and Analogy, or something like that, Analogy and Big Bird. In either case, it's a simplified version of what I talked about in this lecture. It's about 2 pages long, and it should give you the broad general outlines in a very condensed manner of the doctrine of analogy in St. Thomas. In any case, this lecture has gone on for far too long, and I lost my mind a little while ago. So, God bless you all, stay safe, and I will see you later this week.